So step 3 is applying the collar to the neckline. So here's our collar that we've sewn. Got it fused and stitched together, and it's turned right side out and pressed. So it's now ready to apply to the neckline. So the steps that I didn't demonstrate just before this was sewing up the facing together and stitching it on to the neckline. So that would need to be done first. So you stitch the facings together like that, there and there, and then you stitch along the center front lines. Okay, I've also done an understitch there in terms of keeping the facing back. All right, so when you've done all that, what you end up with is kind of an oval shape. You can see it there when I open it out, that there is an oval shape here between the bodice neckline and the facing neckline. And then essentially the collar, if you open it up, has a kind of an oval shape. And so what you're going to do is place that down along here, and it's going to get pinned to here, and then this side is going to get pinned to the other side. Okay, so we open it like that. You can see it's like the two ovals are lining up. Now this is easier said than done, because the collar, as you can see, is a straight line, and this is a very steep curve. It's challenging to pin the two of them together. So it's really the most difficult part of sewing the collar is this step. So what we're going to do is I'm going to start by pinning the start, or start and finish, or one side and the other, as we might call it. Then we're going to line up the center backs. Then we're going to line up the notches, which are here on the collar and which correspond to the seams there. Now here is the most tricky bit, because it's a very steep curve on the neckline and very straight on the collar. So I'm just continuing to pin here, matching the center back notches. And what you'll end up with then is something that looks like this. Often people think this collar doesn't fit into the neckline, it's too big. But just remember that the neckline is a sharp curve, and so the line in here on this side of the seam allowance is very short in measurement compared to the line along here along the straight. So we're not trying to match the edges of the seam allowance, we're trying to match the 1.5. So this is going to be very curvy. That would be normal. You see your notches to line up with the shoulder. See, now the shoulder's at an angle, so remember that we're the notch is pointing to matching 1.5 in, so from that point, so 1.5 down from here. You can measure with your measuring tape if you like. Should go through that seam. Okay, so it takes a little while to measure this, to pin this into place. Sometimes I put it into three-dimensional shape, so you see the way when it goes into the three-dimensional shape, we can see that at 1.5, where we're going to sew, the seams will probably match. Here, there's a lot of extra on the seam allowance. So this is going to take a while and quite a few pins. Okay, and keep putting it into the three-dimensional shape and pinning, because that's going to be your best bet for getting it to be accurate. And I put in quite a lot of pins. And so the collar takes a good bit of time, particularly if it's tight up close to the neck. If it's close to the neck, you've got a really steep curve. This is the bit that takes the most practice, and what I would advise is pin it in, and if you have the chance to check with your tutor to check it. Otherwise, just keep pinning it until you know that it's the best it possibly can be in terms of lined up, how it's lined up. So now I have the collar all pinned and ready to go, ready to sew. So I'm going to start to sew this along, and start, I suppose, where you like, but generally try and start at the seam there at the centre front. So like with anything that you're sewing, you're doing a few things at once, where you're paying attention to the 1.5, so your seam allowance is always on the 1.5, as well as guiding your fabric through and arranging the fabric that's just in front of the machine. So I'm just taking the pins out as I go. And as I sew, because I know this is coming into the more curvy bit, I am checking underneath that the fabric is straight, that it's not going to be creating a tuck in front here. So I'm only ever working on the few centimetres that are in front of my machine, really. I would also say that if you notice that there is a tuck happening, or that it's likely there's a tuck, to just keep going. It's easier often to just take the tuck out later. Usually a little rip and a restitch does it. And I'm also trying to all the time keep my eye on the 1.5 there. For the end. And voila, so the collar will look very, tensiony. It will be very hard to get it to sit correctly. So the last step for your collar, when you have it all sewn on, and you can see it's all lots of tension, you turn it to the inside, and you're going to snip all the way along, straight snips, and this releases the tension, so the collar will sit better along the other side. Now you can just start with snips about a couple of centimetres apart. You can always come back in and do more snips, particularly in areas that need it. But for the start, you can just estimate. Usually here needs more, closer together, because it's a steeper curve. And then we can go here. And so that will release some of the tension so that it will sit a little bit better. And now we just need to press it. So the seam allowance needs to get pressed open and then attached. So when you're pressing the collar, you can use a tailor's ham or maybe a sleeve board or something, because it is a curved shape. And you do want to, don't be trying to attempt to press it along a straight surface, because it won't work. Okay, so you can only be able to press a small bit at a time. Okay, and it has been snipped already. It's getting a bit fiddly. If you just go right the way around, using whatever part of the ham seems to suit the curve. So the very last step to finishing your collar, you can see here we have snipped everything, pressed it open, everything is ready. And what you would do is, generally speaking, put half of the seam allowance up into the collar and half going down to spread the bulk. So you would separate everything like that, and lining up the seams. And yes, it's a bit tricky because there's all these little separate pieces, and particularly here if it's been snipped down quite a number of times. And so you're going to stitch along here, and what I mean is you don't want to look too close there because you'd end up stitching onto the collar. So you want to be sure they're lined up, and it would be important to line the seams up. If there's anything out, it will create a pull in the collar. So if I don't line these up, for example, there will be like a pull or a twist in the collar. So this might seem quick and easy enough step, but it's actually really important for the finish that things are lined up correctly. So it's kind of pinned and ready for the stitch, and you would simply stitch along. If it's very bulky fabric, sometimes I've needed to use a zip foot because the fabric on this side is too bulky. This isn't too bulky, so I should be able to just stitch right along, keeping the two together and stitching close enough to that seam, not touching anything underneath. Hopefully I'm nearly at the end. Ta-da! Hopefully the collar, turn it around. And there we go. The collar is now attached underneath. Okay, so there you have your collar finished. So here we have our collar finished. So once it goes onto three-dimensional form, it sits much better. Like that. Okay. Okay, so there's our little sample, and you can see from the inside that it's only when it goes on the three-dimensional form that that facing finally sits back and behaves itself there. Okay, so there'll be a need for final pressing and arranging